Welcome to Under the Rug at Work, where I shine light on things that are normally swept under the rug. Today, we're going to talk about mental health to remove some of the stigma and share the facts with Kate Simpson. Kate has more than a decade's experience representing employers and is the founder of EmploySafe Legal. Thank you so much for joining me, Kate. This is a really interesting topic.
Thank you, Nicole.
Now, we know that people are often afraid to disclose mental health conditions at work because we're afraid of being discriminated against or treated differently. But then again, on the flip side, managers often don't ask for their team to disclose any ill health because they might not know what to do, they might not know how to manage staff with an illness, or they're confused by the laws, which happens a lot. And especially if they need to manage performance. So I'm really excited to have this chat with you today because I know a lot of employers are and managers are pretty confused. So thank you again. But before we jump in, I'd love if you could share some of the stats around mental health in Australia and specifically in the workplace. You've got some great things to share.
Yeah, I'd love to start, Nicole, with some stats on stigma specifically. So, the Diversity Council of Australia in 2022 published some statistics that tell us that the stigma around mental health remains even after COVID-19. I think a lot of people got the impression that there was more open conversations around mental health as a result of the pandemic, and there were, but we still do have that stigma. The Diversity Council of Australia found that 4 out of 10 workers are silent about mental health at work, and workers who did discuss their mental health were twice as likely to report experiencing discrimination or harassment at work compared to those who didn't say anything.
Mm.
Another interesting finding was that 80% of senior executives strongly agreed that their workplace was safe and supportive for people with poor mental health, but only 50% of employees at those lower levels agreed. So there is a disparity between what our senior executives feel or think and how that's perceived by our lower level workers. It's also important to understand what stigma is. So stigma comes in 3 types. We can have self-stigma, where we internalize and accept negative stereotypes, and that might prevent people from speaking up. We have public stigma, where society has a negative attitude towards a particular group. And then we have structural stigma, where there's a level of discrimination in the system. So we might have some cultural norms or practices, and that's something that we'll be focusing on today.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that explanation. And it is interesting to hear those stats, but thinking about my time in workplaces, it makes sense and it really depends on the leader and the manager and how supportive they are, but also the relationships that they have with the team. Because if you don't have a good relationship, then you're probably not going to share these things. And it's really sad to hear and to see that people are discriminated against, which just keeps the stigma there, right? Um, but I'd love to hear too, and I think it's really important to differentiate the difference between a mental health condition and neurodivergence. Can you clear some things up for us there?
So, mental health and neurodiversity refer to distinct concepts, even though they are connected. And the starting point is to look at what mental health is. So, mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes their own potential, they can cope with the normal stresses of life, they can work productively, and they can make a contribution. We then have the flip side, which is mental illness. So, mental illness is a clinically significant disturbance of someone's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior. And we usually associate that with an element of distress. And when we talk about mental illness, we're thinking about anxiety, depression, bipolar, post traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, and eating disorders. We then have 2 terms that we'll be using a bit during this discussion, which are neurotypical and neurodiverse. Those aren't medical terms, but someone who is neurotypical is generally considered to be someone whose neurologically development is not different to the norm. And that term is something that's really been embraced by the autism community. We then have neurodiverse, which is someone who's neurologically developed. So neurological development includes differences from the norm, and we associate that with conditions like ADHD and spectrum disorders. People who are neurodiverse don't necessarily have a psychological disability, and they might have coping mechanisms that allow them to hide the condition from managers and employers. However, if those differences are identified and accommodated, that person could thrive.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to help not only through this podcast, but in our work to help people thrive. And understanding those differences, I think, is really important. So I really appreciate you doing that, because we need to understand that at a higher level to then understand how we can best support our staff. And one of the big areas of confusion is the legislation. And as you know, it's open to interpretation. And there's so much legislation. And I feel like that's why managers and employers don't act or know what to do, is because there's so much out there, and it's really hard, and no one's sitting there and reading the act on a weekend with a cup of tea. So I'm grateful that you're here today, because I'd love if you could provide us with an overview of those anti-discrimination and the relevant laws and what employers and managers need to know.
Certainly, and I couldn't agree with you more on that point. During my 10 years in practice, the number of times I have spoken to an employer and they've said, I think this person might have depression, or they might have a substance abuse issue, or they might have a neurodivergence, but I don't want to ask them, because then once I ask them, I'm going to have all these other obligations that I either don't have the capacity to manage, I don't have the resources to manage, or I don't really understand how to manage them. It's just countless, really. And there is quite a complex framework of laws, and they're complex because they overlap. And the key laws I would like to draw you to today are the Fair Work Act, the anti-discrimination laws, and the work health and safety legislation. All of these laws come together to tell us that employees have a right to work in a safe environment that's free from bullying and discrimination, and that where someone has a disability, we mustn't discriminate against them, and we must give them reasonable adjustments to perform their duties. So that would be the overriding principle. I did want to start off with the Fair Work Act. So the Fair Work Act applies on a national level. It protects employees from discrimination because it's unlawful to take adverse action against an employee because they have a protected attribute, and those attributes include a mental disability. Adverse action includes things like not hiring a potential employee, treating an employee differently to other employees, and changing an employee's job to their disadvantage. By way of example, we did have the results of a conciliation conference published by the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Commission. There was a candidate who's referred to as Sarah in the example. She applied for a job as a community care worker with an aged care provider. She did a great job in the interview. It went longer than she expected. She felt really confident. She did disclose during that interview that she suffered from anxiety and depression. And notwithstanding, she progressed to the next stage. She had a police check and a pre-employment medical, and then she was denied the position. Mm-hmm. She picked up the phone and spoke to someone who disclosed that the reason she didn't get the job was because her level of anxiety and depression made her unsuitable, and she lodged a complaint with the Anti-Discrimination Commission. There were no findings made because it was settled at conciliation. The employer denied that they'd made the decision based on her condition, and they gave another reason based on her answers during the interview. But they did end up settling that dispute for $5,000. And that's an example of an employer really misunderstanding the right to not employ someone based on a disability, because that employee could still perform the inherent requirements of the job, and they should have been given reasonable adjustments to assist them to do so. I would like to touch upon the Disability Discrimination Act. So we have the Commonwealth Act, and then each state and territory has their own legislation as well. Discrimination under the Disability Discrimination Act occurs when someone is treated less favourably, or they're not given the same opportunities as others in the same position because of their disability. It's unlawful to discriminate against someone because of their disability, and there's also an extension where it's unlawful to discriminate against someone because of the disability of others they might be associated with. The definition of disability is really, really broad because it extends to physical, intellectual, psychiatric, sensory, neurological, and learning disabilities. And it extends to conditions that presently exist, previously existed, but no longer exist, and may exist in the future. So if you're ever in doubt as to whether a condition is protected under the Disability Discrimination Act, Chances are it is, even if it's not explicitly stated, as is the case with neurodiversity. This legislation hasn't caught up yet to our use of these terms. So neurodivergence itself is not specified in that act. Case law in this area is really sparse, even though reports of discrimination are very high. And that might be because people with neurodivergence don't consider themselves to have disability in the traditional sense, and that makes them less likely to make a claim. There are two different types of discrimination. So firstly, we have direct discrimination, which is unlawful if a discriminator treats or proposes to treat the person less favorably than they would someone without that disability in the same circumstances, or if the discriminator doesn't provide reasonable adjustments with the effect the person's treated less favorably. And an example of direct discrimination is not hiring someone like Sarah in our previous example because she has a mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
Indirect discrimination doesn't have to be deliberate, being the second type of discrimination, but it can occur due to a lack of awareness about a negative impact a policy might have on someone who has disability or mental illness. Indirect discrimination happens if a discriminator requires or proposes to require the person to comply with the requirement, and because of the disability, that person can't comply, or complying is likely to disadvantage them. And it can also occur if the person doesn't provide those reasonable adjustments to allow the person to comply. Examples of indirect discrimination include having maybe a blanket policy where all employees have to come to work at 7 a.m. every day, and a person with mental illness might not be able to comply because perhaps they take medication and that makes it hard for them to wake up. So in that case, that person might be subject to indirect discrimination, and they hopefully would disclose that to their employer so that reasonable adjustments could be made.
Yeah.
So examples of adjustments that might be reasonable for someone who has a mental illness or neurodivergence might be things like job rotation. So if someone's doing duties that might exacerbate their condition, having a lot of contact with customers who might be aggressive, for example, then that might be suitable for them. Having variable start and finish times, working from home, giving instructions in writing rather than verbally, moving the workspace to a quieter area, or even taking steps of installing a privacy screen so that someone has personal space at work, even in an open plan office. Underpinning everything, we have the Work Health and Safety Act. So employers must take all steps reasonably practicable to ensure employees are not injured at work. And this includes people who have a mental illness or neurodivergence, but it also means other employees. And when considering whether an adjustment is reasonable, an employer has to consider the effect on not only the person who's seeking the adjustment, but also other employees who might be affected by the adjustment. So on that note, I mentioned earlier before we started recording that I spent about 3 years working for one of Australia's largest supermarkets. And they have a particular model where the employees in the store have to be able to perform a number of different functions. And when an employee became unfit to perform one function, so in the case of a psychological injury, it might be a job on the register, then that caused other employees to have to take on the burden of other duties. And so in that case, it might not be reasonable to provide the adjustment, being removing that employee from the register.
Yeah. And a lot of those adjustments don't sound unreasonable. It's just that we aren't sure what to do. So instead of looking into these things or having a chat with someone like you, which has been incredible, we just keep busy with the work and stick our head down and hope that it goes away. So I really appreciate you going through some of those adjustments, because they really do make sense in places where they can. So I love how, yeah, you pulled that out. And one of the things you spoke about is working from home. And since COVID, we have worked much more flexibly than we ever have before, which has been incredible. But in some instances, as you said, like being a cashier, you can't work from home, unfortunately. But there's also requirements under the Fair Work Act when it comes to flexible work. Did you want to just share a little bit about that to give people some insights on what they need to know?
Certainly. So we talked a moment ago about how this framework of laws really overlaps, and the concept of flexible work requests is something that overlaps with obligations under the Disability Discrimination Act. So essentially, a flexible work request can be made by an employee under the Fair Work Act if they meet certain criteria. So one of the criteria is that that person may have a disability, and they have to have also met a minimum period of service, which is 12 months for full-time and part-time employees, and certain rules apply for casuals. So an employee makes a request in writing, they disclose they have this condition perhaps, and the accommodation they're seeking, and the employer has to respond within 21 days. Examples of requests include reduced hours and start and finish times, split shifts, job shares, working from home. And an employer must discuss that with the employee, and they must genuinely try to reach an agreement. And they must give consideration for the consequences of refusing a request if they do so. There are timeframes for responding to the request, which are 21 days. And if the parties don't agree on the accommodations or the refusal to provide accommodations, then either party can refer that as a dispute to the Fair Work Commission. So again, an employee can make a request under these provisions of the Fair Work Act, or they can also make a request under the Disability Discrimination Act for reasonable adjustments there.
Yeah. And really, no one wants to go through the commission or, have mediation or conflict in the team. So it's best to be able to come to a win-win arrangement. And where I found, or where I find in workplaces where there's conflict and struggle is when the conversations aren't had and where decisions are made that don't actually make any sense. Like if someone's able to work from home and is more productive to do that, and they'd like to do that, part-time and come into the office part-time, restricting that just because you want people back in the office and to be able to see them because you feel like when you're looking at them, then they're doing work because they're there, is often where people start to come undone. So having the end in mind, being a win-win for everyone, and aiming to reduce the conflict, but also understanding that you have business requirements as well. So maybe they won't meet that, and it does need to be fair and transparent. So yeah, it's great to talk to a lawyer about this.
Just to build on what you said a moment ago about working from home, there actually was a decision last year where an employee had requested a flexible work arrangement under the Fair Work Act, and they'd asked to work from home. And the request was denied on the basis that it might set a precedent for other employees, but they would also expect to work from home. And the Fair Work Commission said that that was not a sufficient reason, and that person should have been afforded that request.
Yeah. And the benefit too is, you can reduce your office space if you need to as well. Like we need to be looking at these things a bit more creatively than, well, we used to be in 9 to 5 or, 8 till 7 or whatever crazy hours some people do. But we're in a new normal now. So what does that look like for the individual, and what does that look like for the team and the organization? Like we really need to look at it at that big picture instead of saying, well, no, for this silly reason.
100%. I think there have been some really interesting studies on the business case for having more neurodivergent teams. And it's really sad to look at the statistics of people who are neurodivergent. They want to be in employment, but they're not. When we compare that to how successful they can actually be if they are embraced in the workplace, and if we accept that it's not one size fits all, and let people share their needs so we can accommodate them so that they can actually thrive. So Deloitte did a survey on neurodivergence in 2022, and they found that teams with neurodivergent professionals in some roles can be 30% more productive. And that when we have neurodivergent people in the team, we can really tap into creativity, attention to detail, hyper detail, entrepreneurialism, all these great things. And Autism Spectrum Australia, if you visit their website, they have a whole page of examples of cases where neurodivergent people were incorporated and the results were really positive. For example, there was a team in a government department that had a backlog of firewall security event logs. The estimated time to clear the backlog was 18 months, but this neurodiverse team cleared it in 4 months. And at the same time, they redesigned the whole process.
That's incredible. And that's what true diversity does, right? You have the right people in the right role with the right support, and look at what can happen. That's amazing. But let's look at the other side. So, if employers or managers do need to performance manage someone with a mental health condition, what's your advice to help them do that the right way?
The starting point that I always recommend is to have a really clear position description. And that position description should set out what the inherent requirements of the job are. So, the inherent requirements of the job are those essential functions that need to be completed for the job to be successful. So, those are what are the functions of the job? So, what are the core duties? What are the productivity and quality requirements? So, if there are some KPIs for that job, they really should be listed in the position description. You might have the ability to work effectively in a team and the ability to work safely. Second, if and when you find that an employee is not performing, you should discuss that with them. You might suspect that a person has a mental illness or they might be neurodivergent. And I think sometimes with all of the information that's around these days, it's easy to be a bit of an armchair psychologist and sit back and diagnose people with conditions. But we certainly should not be doing that. So, the most that we can do as an employer is to make it safe for a person to tell us if they're suffering from a condition. And you can do that by saying to the person, you haven't been performing. These are the examples and the criteria that you haven't been meeting. Is there any reason you haven't been able to meet these? If the person doesn't disclose their condition, you can't force them to, and you can move forward in a sensitive way, but you can only make your decisions based on the information that you have. If you know the person has a mental illness or neurodivergence, you should discuss this with them in a transparent way. So you can say to them, look, I know that you have depression. I know that you have been struggling in your personal life, but you're not performing these duties that we need you to perform. And is there anything that we can give you or any support we can give you that would help you to perform the duties? So we're not actually changing what the inherent requirements of the job are. We're not reducing the KPIs, but we're putting in place measures that would help the person to achieve the KPIs or the essential functions. So the third thing that we need to do is if the person has suggested some adjustments, so maybe they've said, well, I really need to work part-time for a while, or I need to have different work hours, then we should certainly accommodate those if we can. Sometimes we won't be able to accommodate them, or sometimes the employee will require accommodations for a period of time that's so long that it becomes unjustifiable for us. It imposes too much of a hardship. And we might find that the person can't perform the inherent functions of the job. We can't accommodate them, and it's time to move that person on in a compassionate way. And at that point, I would always suggest getting legal advice. And we should also be considering whether or not it's necessary to involve the person's treating practitioners. So send perhaps a survey or request a medical report from the general practitioner or from the psychologist with the employee's consent, and find out exactly what the triggers are, what the accommodations are that we could provide, and how long this state of affairs is likely to continue. In terms of my tips for these processes, aside from having that clear position description in place, and of course, making sure the person understands the requirements of the position at an early stage, we should have a performance management process and protocol that's written down and that we apply universally to everyone. And we shouldn't be varying that for particular employees. We should be applying that as it is. We need to focus on the performance and not the mental illness. So we're looking at, okay, these are the functions of the job. This is what we need you to do. And then as a backseat, what accommodations can we provide to you to allow you to perform those duties? And then we should use the existence of any information that we have about that person to provide a sensitive and empathetic process, including perhaps the use of an employee assistance program.
I love that. Simple steps that employers and managers can follow, that still focuses on the positive outcome that you want. It's not about getting anyone, or performance managing people for in a discriminated way. It's about getting that win-win and saying, how can we help? What can we do to support you? But sometimes these tough conversations need to happen. So having that all set up to start with is really great. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. And I think sometimes a person just isn't suited to a job as well. And perhaps by going through this process, we can release them, and then they can go into something that suits them better, or an industry that suits them better.
Mm,
On that note, I did want to share a couple of cases with you just so that you can really understand how this works.
yeah.
So the first case is an Aldi stores case. So this one was published only in 2022. We had a lady called Sarah, another Sarah, who was a store manager employed by Aldi since 2018. She had a trauma outside of work that caused her to have post-traumatic stress disorder, in which involved the death of her husband. In 2021, she had an aggravation of that condition when someone collapsed at work, and she was absent due to her medical condition for an extended period of time. The employer put her through a process of assessing her condition, assessing what reasonable accommodations could be provided, and the accommodations that she needed were quite extensive. So essentially, as a store manager, she said, for example, that she'd need to be rostered alongside at least one assistant manager and two store manager trainees. And the employer in that case found that the requested adjustments weren't reasonable, and she was dismissed. And she took this one to the Fair Work Commission, and they found that the employer had been fair and reasonable, and that her dismissal had not been unfair in that case. They
Mm,
did go through an extensive process there.
yeah.
The other case I wanted to share with you was a 2019 case of a gentleman who was dismissed for serious misconduct. He had engaged in a bit of a pattern of conduct, and what it culminated in was him driving dangerously in the employer's car park, behaving in an angry and aggressive manner, and telling another staff member he might have to kill someone. He made an unfair dismissal claim, and the commission was very sympathetic to him at first instance, and they said that his conduct was related to his mental illness. That was appealed by the employer, who was successful. And the commission found that even though this gentleman had a mental illness, it didn't negate the seriousness of his actions. And there actually wasn't a causal link between his behavior and the mental illness, which
Mm,
was an adjustment disorder and anxiety. So in
mm.
that case, that man was also fairly dismissed.
Yeah, and with those kind of cases, you need to look at the safety of everyone in the team as well, right? So behavior like that is quite unsafe, not only to the team, but if there's any volunteers, contractors, and customers around, then yeah, you need to protect everyone in that space. Yeah. So can you, before we jump off, can you share some recommendations for employers to help them set themselves and the team up for success? What do they need to do?
Think that the key thing I'd love everyone to go away with is the concept of the eggshell skull. So when we hire an employee, yes, we can do pre-employment medicals, we can find out everything we can about them, but we do have to take them as we find them. So someone might be predisposed to a mental illness, they might have an existing neurodivergence, and the fact that those things exist prior to us employing them doesn't mean that we are less liable for any injuries that happen to them at work, or for the way that we have to treat them at work under discrimination laws. You might be surprised by how many people in your workforce are actually affected by this issue because of that stigma that hangs over mental illness and neurodivergence. And many people have found ways to mask their condition, and to hide those things away. And under stressful conditions, we might find that they emerge. And when that happens, we need to be quite sensitive and empathetic to those people. Aside from understanding that concept of the eggshell skull, I did have some other practical tips. So, firstly, employers should have a transparent system for managing employees with mental health concerns, and they should provide training so that employees have awareness of those issues. They can have open discussions and dialogues, and they can have the confidence to speak up with reduced fear of stigma. Larger organizations could create a reference committee for diversity and inclusion initiatives. Employers should train their leaders and managers to recognize signs of distress so that they can have those sensitive conversations with their employees. And they should encourage senior leaders to share their experiences with mental health challenges. Because as we know, safety culture comes from the top. And by having our executive leaders speaking openly about their own challenges, this will just flow through to the rest of the workforce and really reduce that stigma.
Mm. Yeah, great points. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you for unpacking the legislation and giving us the key things that we really need to know, and sharing your insights. I really appreciate it. And if people want to find out more, and work with you, what's the best way to connect with you?
The best way would be via my website, which is employsafelegal.com.au.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nicole.